we don't want to waste any time in turning things over to our incredibly distinguished guests on our first panel. My name is Julian Gonzalez-Poirier. I am a first-year student in the RICA MA program here at Harvard. I graduated from Middlebury College and realized that I wanted to continue my study of the region, and the Davis Center was the perfect place to do just that.
And my name is Alwyn Blessing. I'm also a first-year student in the RICA MA program, but I'm from rural North Carolina. I worked for many years in the North Carolina legislature before coming to Harvard, and I became very curious about whether Russia's legislative bodies might work in similar ways.
Our job is to introduce the incredible speakers on our first panel, which is going to tackle where we are now in the war in Ukraine. Our first speaker will be Professor Serhii Plokhy, the Mykhailo Hrushevs'kyi Professor of Ukrainian History and the Director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. A leading authority on Ukraine, Russia, and Eastern Europe, Professor Plokhy has published extensively on the international history of World War II and the Cold War. His latest book, The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, was released in May 2023. Nataliya Bugayova is a non-resident fellow at the Institute for the Study of the War. She focuses on the Kremlin's decision-making, information operations, and global campaigns from Ukraine to Africa. She previously led ISW's Russia open source intelligence team, where she helped build the analytical framework that continues to serve as a foundation for ISW's reporting on Russia. Nataliya currently serves as the Director of Strategic Intelligence at Vertical Knowledge, a US data and technology company. Originally from Ukraine, Nataliya worked on reform efforts in Ukraine in a number of roles. She was the chief executive officer of the Kyiv Post and served as the advisor to the Ukrainian Minister of the Economy after the Euromaidan revolution in 2014.
And it is an incredible honor for me to introduce two of the most impressive women in the field of Russian studies. Fiona Hill is a senior fellow at Brookings and the chancellor at Durham University in the UK. She was recently elected to Harvard's Board of Overseers, which is only fair given that she is a proud graduate of the Davis Center's MA program. And she also earned a PhD in history at Harvard. Dr. Hill served as deputy assistant to the president and senior director for European and Russian affairs on the U.S. National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. Like Dr. Stent, she served as the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the U.S. National Intelligence Council from 2006 to 2009, and you may have seen her testify at the 2019 congressional impeachment hearings. Dr. Hill has researched and published extensively on issues related to Russia, regional conflicts, and strategic issues. Her work on the link between deindustrialization and political populism is the foundation for her latest book, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. And Professor Angela Stent is senior advisor to Georgetown Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies, and professor emerita of government and foreign service at Georgetown University. She is also a senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution and senior advisor to the United States Institute of Peace. Dr. Stent has served as a member of more important advisory panels and councils than we can list here. But as I mentioned before, she served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council from 2004 to 2006. Dr. Stent's primary research focus is Russian foreign policy, with special emphasis on the triangular US-Europe-Russia relationship. Her latest book is Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. She received her BA from Cambridge University, her MSc with distinction from the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is also an alumna of the RICA MA program and also received her PhD from Harvard.
Professor Blau, over to you.
Thank you very much. Those are wonderful introductions, and it's a great pleasure to welcome our speakers and our audience to this panel. It's the first panel of the day, as you know. It's on the war in Ukraine. Where are we now? And I have definitely been, looking forward to this panel with great anticipation and excitement for a long time. We're very fortunate to have four of the leading experts in Ukraine and Russia and the war with us today. And I'm going to cut to the chase here because we want to use the time as efficiently as possible and to give you an occasion to discuss and ask questions. So I've asked each of our distinguished panelists to start us off with 8 to 10 minutes of remarks, and then we will open the floor to Q&A. So I want to start by asking Serhii to begin the discussion by giving his perspective on the war and where we are right now, and in particular, where Ukraine finds itself at this stage of the war, which you have looked at in depth through a very long historical lens in your wonderful book on the Russo-Ukrainian War. So, Serhii.
Sure. First, thank you, and thank you. It's an honor to be part of this conference, of this panel. I will deal mostly with, being a historian, deal mostly with history, with difficult issues of history and identity and ideology, leaving the easy questions about past, present, and future to my colleagues on the panel. One anecdote that still travels around the corridors of this building and Davis Center in general is about the year 1991, when the news came about Ukraine voting for independence and eventually the fall of the Soviet Union. And Ned Kinnan, who was a major presence at the center and at the Department of History, expert on early modern Russian and East European history, he allegedly said at that time, well, if this is serious, there should be a war between Russia and Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And something that certainly was against the grain in the year 1991, with high expectations for the democratic transformation of Russia, of Ukraine, of the space in general. And that was an insight that came really from Ned Kinnan's knowledge of history. Mm-hmm. At least in my opinion, the way how I interpret that remark is that what he had in mind was the history, the bloody history generally of the disintegration of empires. And imperial context in that sense is extremely important for understanding of this war, and also answering the question in historical terms about where Ukraine is right now, but also shedding some light on the question of where Russia is now and where Russia might go from here. One thing that brings in the imperial lenses in understanding this war is certainly the ideology on the Russian side that really fuels the war. Again, we heard about economy, there is military side, but there is also very important ideological side linked to identity. And I really can't recall any other war but this one, where history would make such an important role in justification of something that otherwise would be unjustifiable. And this, of course, pronouncements by Vladimir Putin. This is his essay on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, and the punchline that is right there in the first paragraph of the essay is that the Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. The line coming directly really from the Russian imperial narrative and Russian ideology of the second half of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, which squarely puts, at least ideologically, that war in the context of the history of disintegration of empires, because it was an imperial mantra, it was an imperial belief, which we would call today pan-Russianism, that Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians were one and the same group and the same nation. Well, it's not just about particular Putin's belief. It's also about a long intellectual tradition within Russia itself, but it's also about choosing particular narrative that would work with the Russian society as a whole, where the idea of the nation was very closely connected and linked to the idea of the language particularly of the Russian language. And based on the language situation, you actually was better off making the argument about Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people in 2022 than it was back in 1917. So the pan-Russian narrative became one of the ways to justify the start of the war back in 2014 with the annexation of the Crimea. The first time Putin goes on record stating that Russians and Ukrainians were one and the same people was in the summer of 2013 during his visit to Kyiv, where a conference was organized in his honor at the Kyiv's monastery, and he was accompanied by Patriarch Alexei, one of the institutions that really embodied the idea of the unity of Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians at the expense of Ukrainians and Belarusians. Because, of course, when Putin says Russians and Ukrainians one and the same people, what he means is that Ukrainians are Russians and they're not supposed to exist. Now, Crimea also introduced another important narrative into that story of justification of the war, because the argument was made on the basis at the end when Russia was losing Ukraine after the Revolution of Dignity, it was going for the project of Greater Russia, with the argument that ethnic Russians constituted the majority in the Crimea, and from that point of view, the annexation was justifiable, or he tried to justify it. So at the same time, you have these two models of the pan-Russian idea with taking over the entire Ukraine, and the plan B with building Greater Russia. Both models actually go back not only to the pre-1917 Russian intellectual thinking, but there is a bridge between post-Soviet Russia and pre-Soviet Russia, and it's in the person in the writings of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Because if you look at his very important 1990 piece that certainly influenced not just Putin, but the entire generation of young Russians at that time, how we should restructure Russia. Russia, in Solzhenitsyn's view, includes Ukraine, Belarus, and settled by Eastern Slavs parts of northern Kazakhstan. If you are interested to see where the idea of bridge to Crimea and taking over Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts come from beyond from the geostrategic and military considerations, please open Solzhenitsyn's writings from the late 1990s, Россия в обвале, The Russian Question, and you will see there Crimea, you will see there Kherson, you will see there Melitopol, you'll see all these places that became known to the general public through the media coverage of the war in Ukraine in the course of the last year. So that is prehistory in terms of the where and how these ideas really come to the fore at the start of this war. The important thing also that they're being used not just out of respect for someone like Uvarov or other 19th century person or Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It comes also out of belief that actually that's sort of idea that can have attraction within the Russian society. And the history of 2022 is really going back to the repertoire of the ideas that was already introduced back in 2014. The idea of taking over, of course, Kyiv altogether, and the idea of denazification of Ukraine, which means really de-Ukrainization of Ukraine, goes back to the pan-Russian idea in general. And then plan B, when that doesn't work, that's, of course, building Greater Russia within the boundaries that were last fall identified in the Russian constitution. Now, the ideology was important, in my opinion, not only in terms of producing narrative that would justify the war, but also in the planning of the war itself. Because the expectation was that would be a limited military operation, that the Ukrainians would actually, because they speak Russian, especially in the eastern parts of Ukraine, that they would welcome Russians. You speak Russian, you are Russian, your loyalty should be to Russia, or more specifically to Kremlin. An underlying ideological narrative, in my opinion, was also partially responsible for the planning and then for the failures of the operation at the beginning of the war. Ukraine mobilized against the very much 19th century imperial understanding of the Russian nation in a very much 21st century way, by uniting across religious, cultural, and linguistic lines. The process of unification and building bridges across those lines that really started in 2014 and continued in 2022. One thing that died on the battlefields of Ukraine very early on was the idea of the pan-Russian nation when it comes to Ukraine, for sure. So the military operation, the war that started with the idea of bringing Russians and Ukrainians together under the umbrella of one pan-Russian identity, not just ended, but almost started with the major defeat to that idea. What we see today in terms of the removal of monuments to Russian-Ukrainian friendship, like it was in Kyiv. It survived 2014, but didn't survive the bombing of Kyiv in February and March of 2022. What you see in terms of the removal of Pushkin's monuments, what you see in terms of the really tense and sometimes unfortunate situation in the church realm with the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. This is basically a continuation of markers of the same process of the death of the pan-Russian idea in Ukraine. We don't know what exactly is happening in Russia today. But my personal feeling that the number of the body bags, the number of wounded and injured soldiers coming back from the fields of Ukraine, imagined as part of Russia, is sending whatever image whatever message it sends, but not the message that Russians and Ukrainians are one and the same people. So future Russia and Russia that will emerge from this war, one thing that will be revised in my understanding for sure is this imperial understanding of itself. Imperial understanding of Russia as part of the East European pan-Russian community. And that's maybe the only silver lining that I see at this point, at this moment in this war. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wonderfully insightful discussion of the ideological and historical foundations. I want to turn to Nataliya now, who has emerged as one of the strongest analysts of the military situation in Ukraine, and ask her to give us a more closely focused look at what is happening on the ground, how the war is going, and how Russia is evolving its strategy in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm also an HKS alum, so it's great always be back on campus and reunite with my alma mater, and especially as a part of this distinguished panel. I'd like to put the situation on the battlefield right now in the context of the military challenge that Ukraine has already surmounted and the challenge that lies ahead. So we are 19 months into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So far, the Kremlin has achieved none of its objectives in this war. Kyiv successfully defeated initial Kremlin's goal to conquer the country in a matter of days and to conduct regime change in Kyiv. The Kremlin still hasn't been able even to secure fully Donetsk and Lugansk regions in the east that Russia has been, portions of which Russia has been illegally occupying for the past 8 years. Ukraine has also liberated a significant amount of its terrain and, most importantly, its people, who would otherwise continue to live under perpetual and daily Russian atrocities as those Ukrainians who are trapped still in the Russian occupation. Last fall, as you recall, Ukraine has conducted 2 successful counteroffensive operations. And it could have gone on a third if the Western aid wasn't trailing Ukraine's battlefield needs. And frankly, the lines would look much different now. However, the West did not proactively reinvest in reinforcing Ukraine's momentum on the battlefield at that time. And Russia, of course, used the reprieve on the battlefield to do what Russia always does, to regroup and prepare for the next attack. And therefore, it used that time to build its defense in depth, as well as regroup. Therefore, the current Ukraine's counteroffensive is a very extraordinarily difficult undertaking for that reason. So where we are today, first of all, Ukraine is successfully holding the front line. And I know that the news and the reporting have really shifted on the discussion of the counteroffensive, but I really want us to remind ourselves what defending that front line actually means. We have hundreds of thousands of Russian troops in Ukraine, over 400,000 according to recent reports. Russia firing at the rate of 10,000 artillery shells a day. And that's, by the way, a substantial decrease from the rate of fire at the same time last year. Just let those numbers sink in, because that's the challenge Ukraine is dealing with when it's simply defending the front line. And we've seen it with the recent Russian push in Avdiivka and Donetsk region, where Kremlin is contributing considerable resources to try to advance in that area. Ukraine is holding that front. Russia lost actually over 1,000 casualties just in that push alone. So that's the kind of defense Ukraine has to undertake every single day, while also trying to advance, while also doing that in the backdrop of often impatient commentaries of armchair spectators. I think additionally, as we look at the front, Ukraine is stretching Russia and pressing Russia across the whole front line, but it's also pushing through Russian defense, at least in two directions. And Ukrainian tactic, and I really want to emphasize that in Crimea, which is an asymmetric tactic fundamentally, is of strategic consequence, because Ukraine has actually successfully prevented the Russian Black Sea Fleet from operating freely and having to reposition some of its assets, as we've seen naval assets from Crimea to Novorossiysk. And it's increasingly making Crimea untenable for the Russian forces, which is a reality that was unthinkable to many a year ago. Now, the challenge that lies ahead of Ukraine is massive, and in no small part because Russia is trying to reconstitute, and Putin made it very clear that he intends to rebuild large-scale warfighting capability for future attacks in the short term and long term. We see no indication of Putin seeking any off-ramp to the point about the Russian strategy and whether it has changed. It has not. The tactics are evolving, but the strategy and strategic objectives remain the same. And they're still not about just forcing Ukraine into neutrality. Actually, Ukraine was technically neutral in 2014 and had a non-aligned status, for those who forgot, until Russia invaded it. It's still not about, of course, protecting Russian speakers, many of whom Russia killed in the areas it occupies. It is certainly not just about territory. And therefore, I think a lot of the land for peace discussions are deeply flawed. The objectives are still remain a full control of Ukraine and eradication of Ukraine's sovereignty and identity. And picking up on some of what Professor Plokhy was talking about, we see it both in word. Putin just reinforced his same messages that he delivered in his ultimatum in 2021 at Valdai conference recently. But we also see it not just in word, we see it in action. Of Russian forces, of actions of Russian forces on the occupied territory, and the deliberate campaign to do two things. One, to fully establish control of those territories, but also to erase Ukrainian governance and identity in those areas. And we see it in efforts from trying to replace full curricula in schools, to ban Ukrainian language, to forcefully deport children, to forcefully mobilize Ukrainians in those territories to fight against Ukrainians. And the list is too long for this panel. But because of that reality, the only way towards sustainable resolution of this war is actually necessitates liberation of all Ukrainian territory. And because anything short of that will create two realities. First, Russia will be able to continue atrocities on any territory that it keeps. And second, it can then use the reprieve that would happen if the front lines are frozen prematurely to reconstitute its force that Putin said he will do. We don't need to guess, hypothesize. It's not an assessment. They're very explicit about their intentions. So therefore, I think to conclude, it's really not the time for the West to get wobbly. It's time to learn from some of the lessons we learned last year and proactively reinforce Ukraine's initiative on the battlefield and plan for the second and the fourth phase of this counteroffensive campaign. As we look into the winter, we assess that the fighting will not stop. Ukraine fighting can slow because of mud and weather. However, it will not stop. And Ukraine will have ability to pick up the fighting in spring when the conditions change, if West proactively supports the military campaign. And I think the two key objectives will be, one, to help Ukraine on one side keep pressure on Russia so it does not get another reprieve on the battlefield, but at the same time help Ukraine reconstitute large-scale penetration capability for another strike as a follow-on in order to keep the momentum going. So hopefully that provides some framing for the conversation, and very much looking forward to the questions.
Well done, Nataliya. Thank you very much, Nataliya. I think one of the very interesting concepts here, or key elements, is the distinction that you make between strategy and tactics. And I think that that's the distinction that von Clausewitz made, the theorist of war, that tactics exploit opportunities where strategies create opportunities. Anyhow, so I think that's fascinating. Fiona, you have been following Russia for a long time from the perspective of both a scholar and a foreign policy expert within government. And so I would ask you if you could give us a sense of how the United States and Europe are coping with the war now 18 months on or in.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I think the problem is that we've gone wobbly, as Nataliya was trying to exhort us not to. And I think if we had a political variant of Serhei's wonderful charts on the sanctions and, the kind of way that things have moved over time, we'd see, actually kind of a very similar effect in terms of the very strong reactions initially from the United States and Europe, which really shocked Putin. In fact, it shocked ourselves. I will also confess I wasn't expecting us to be, quite so resolute in the beginning. But as the realization has come in that the initial thrust on sanctions, a lot of the initial actions that were taken have not had what the desired effects were, as Serhii, very clearly pointed out. There was a lot of misplaced expectations about how quickly things would react and or how effects would manifest themselves from the initial sanctions. Over time, people have started to lose heart and hope in many respects. As Serhei's chart showed, if the war had actually been over decisively, if the Ukrainians had been able to strike some incredible blow, which as Nataliya is pointing out they wouldn't have been without military assistance, then the West would have rallied. But as things have dragged on, the most recent counter-offensive, as armchair generals have been commentating on how this has failed or seemed to have failed, this has really kind of turned the tide of Western support. I think I just dropped my pen on the floor there. I was kind of looking for that there. Yeah, I'll just pick that up because I might want to make a quick note as I'm moving along here to keep myself on track here. Andrew and I had actually, just for the audience, decided to divvy up the response from Western Europe and the United States, which Andrew could very easily talk about as well. She's going to focus focus on the global south, and I'm going to try not to wander into that because there is a whole dimension now of really kind of global perspectives that obviously recent developments in the Middle East complicate things even further. And of course, President Biden linked together for congressional purposes Ukraine and the Middle East in his speech quite recently, which I think will open up a whole other dimensions of wobbliness to the point of perhaps teetering support as a result of that. But Angela's going to comment on that. We can talk about it more in the discussion. But I think there's a couple of things here to pick up on where Serhii started us off and where Serhii and Nataliya have led us in terms of the kind of these time frames. Time's not on my side here either, but time has not been on the side of either Putin, as we've looked at, but also certainly not on Ukraine. And shock was a great galvanizing factor here. For the Germans in particular, and I've just spent 5 months in Germany, was just there last week, they've called this a Zeitenwende, a turning point, an inflection point. For Germany, this really has been an existential shock in the war, and perhaps they're the country that's been most affected by this. Serhii is sitting in France, and we've seen Macron take a very different position from where he did at first. The United Kingdom has seen this as a kind of another opportunity for the finest hour after having broken away from Brexit, and everybody wants to be Churchill. They're just a bit upset that Zelensky is doing a much better job of being Churchill than they've been. Boris Johnson wanted to be Churchill. I think Rishi Sunak is not quite trying to be Churchill, but still everybody is trying to be Churchill in this regard, tripping over themselves to be supportive to Ukraine. But for Germany, this is really where the big debate is happening that might set the tone for here in the United States as well as the rest of Europe. Germany is really starting to wonder whether it can actually weather the storms of this war. And those are both external and internal. I think we need to watch this very closely because Germany might become the dispositive factor in where this war goes next. They've taken in, more than 1 million Ukrainian refugees. But of late, there's been some complaints from German officials that Ukrainian refugees have come in. They've been given very generous stipends, but then they've gone back to Ukraine, and then are kind of coming and going in the course of the war. There's a backlash now from other immigrant and migrant communities about this factor, and also in East Germany itself. Serhii had commented earlier about the reactions in Russia to the sort of shock therapy of the 1990s in the discussion with Craig and others about the effect of a Marshall Plan. We know that East Germans actually did have a Marshall Plan. But they also had this entity, the Treuhand, which actually some of us here in this room were involved in back in the 1990s, which privatized all of the East German companies, but also kicked out pretty much 80% of the workforce of East Germany from their original jobs. And that has had a really lingering effect. The economy of East Germany is really good, but the political sentiment in East Germany is very negative. You're seeing, 35% support and rising for the alternative for Deutschland, and Ukraine is factoring into this now as well. We're hearing, many Germans say we don't want to keep supporting refugees, we don't want to keep supporting the war. We've got a lot of problems because, of course, the whole German economic miracle of the last 10, 20 years was all based on very cheap Russian gas. As well as a very highly export-oriented economy, mostly to places like China, which of course got affected by COVID. And the biggest source of crisis in Germany after the outbreak of the war was the cutoff of Russian gas. I know the German economy has done relatively well. It would be interesting to have Serhii give us a chart about how Germany has done on this. There is now a perception that over the longer term that Germany has just shot itself in the foot. The Germans, more than any other European country, thought that 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union meant a Europe free, whole and at peace. They, of course, had reintegration, but also decades ahead of perpetual prosperity. And that really has not been the case. They were also hit by the 2008-2009 financial crisis, but they've been hit hardest of all by having to not just wean themselves, but abruptly go cold turkey and get off on Russian gas. And the fear now is that the much vaunted sectors of the German auto industry, metallurgical industry, that even though it's still doing well for now, will not be over the longer term. And here in the United States, with our massive investments in infrastructure, the Inflation Reduction Act, which of course is really a green energy act, and 1.5 trillion uptake of tax benefits for investments in infrastructure and new parts of the economy will really impinge on Germany's competitiveness. So all of this is leading towards a discourse that is really starting to take hold in Germany now as how to get out of this. While on the public level, we're here with Ukraine for the long haul, as we're saying as well, that the Germans themselves are sort of reading the room in Europe. We've got Hungary that's always been implacably opposed to helping out Ukraine, of course, has, let's just say, some territorial aspirations of its own with Uzhhorod and Transcarpathian Ukraine. Many people here have probably written about this and had a look at it. Also, no desire whatsoever to go off cheap Russian gas. The Hungarians have maintained their basically dependence on the gas, which also Austria and other countries have. We've had Slovakia, Roberto Fico being basically installed again as prime minister there, who wants to stop arms supplies to Ukraine and also cut back on the EU's support for Ukraine. And of course, we've had debates in other countries as well, but I think the most important debate is now going on inside of Germany. And it's Germany where a lot of the ideas are coming out of just what Nataliya was talking about, which is territorial endgames. Mm-hmm. We've seen a number of the German think tanks come up with an idea of perhaps securing Ukraine over the longer term by NATO entry, which the United States actually, frankly, isn't very keen on. But this is German think tanks. It's not the German government doesn't seem keen on this at this moment for ensuring Ukraine's security. But also then thinking that would then lock in place just exactly what Nataliya said is the great fear of a kind of Eastern Ukraine. A Ukraine divided perhaps down the Dnieper with not the full Zaporizhia and Kherson incorporated into Russia. But it actually overlooks just exactly what Nataliya and Serhii have been saying, the fact that Putin is basically saying there's no such thing as Ukrainians. So any Ukrainians living in East Ukraine, if this was like East and West Germany prior to unification, would not in fact be Ukrainians. They wouldn't be speaking the Ukrainian language. There wouldn't be a Ukrainian autonomy. Some of the Germans are also talking about Finland losing 7% of its territory and then having the Finno-Ugric autonomies in Karelia elsewhere. This would not be the case. Putin has also, and this is another point, been worrying about the demography of Russia. And part of the push for more Russians, they'd be the Belarusians, White Russians, or Mali Rossianye, Ukrainians, Little Russians, was to boost the number of Russians to reverse some of the demographic decline. So every signal from Putin, the Kremlin, and Russia is that Ukrainians would not exist. So there would be no East Ukraine to reincorporate under some of these scenarios that are being put forward. But this is a very serious debate that's going on now, perhaps outside of all of the public view, but inside of Germany itself. And then when this comes to the United States, the German government and the current US administration have been more joined at the hip than at any conceivable recent time. Let's just say under the Trump administration, Germany was the bête noire, and there was a real rift in relations. And the Biden administration has really embraced the German Chancellery and the current German coalition. And so the question is really whether this German concerns about really domestic issues as much as anything else are going to really feed into a shift in position on Ukraine and on the external perspective, because it really comes down in Europe, as it does here, to this trade-off between domestic politics and larger security. No one denies the fact that what Russia has done is a massive challenge to European security. It completely overturns the whole idea of Europe as we all envisaged it after the 1990s onwards. But it's the whole domestic debates, the grievance politics in all of European countries, the economic downturn in most of the European countries, but especially in Germany, that could be driving some of this forward now.
Thank you, Fiona. I think that it's fascinating and really important and interesting to understand the critical role of Germany, and in fact, as a bit of a bellwether in this and what's happening on the ground. So thank you very much. And Angela, I understand that for the past year, you have been looking at how countries in the global south, Israel and Turkey, view their relations with Russia and with the Russia-Ukraine war. And given what's happening in the Middle East right now, this could really hardly be more timely. And I wonder if you could give us a sense of what you have learned in this research.
Sure. So thank you very much, Eve, and it's wonderful to be back at Harvard at the center. When I got my PhD degree, our commencement speaker was Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
Oh, wow.
And for someone who had spent, the past 8 years at Harvard doing an MA, a PhD in this subject, it was wonderful. He gave quite a controversial speech. He did, surprise, he did accuse the West of being wobbly, that we weren't standing up to the Soviet Union, we weren't standing up to Cuba, et cetera, et cetera. And he had a number of memorable lines, one of which was, people have the right not to know. So just think about that as you go about your daily tasks. Anyway, I am going to talk briefly about the reaction of the Global South to the war in Ukraine. It's been notable since the war began in February of 2022 that much of the Global South has refused to condemn Russia, it's refused to sanction Russia, or to characterize Russian aggression in Ukraine as colonialism or imperialism. They just don't accept that. And these realities, and to come back to what Eve was saying, have been reinforced now by the outbreak of the war between Israel and Hamas, which is already changing dynamics in the Middle East. And Russia, of course, has welcomed this war as a diversion away from people focusing on the Russia-Ukraine war. And Russia is, in fact, trying to use the conflict now in the Middle East as a way of enhancing its own regional role. So, as Eve said, I did spend much of the past academic year involved in a project where we had virtual dialogues with our counterparts, experts, academics, and people in think tanks about their relations with Russia and about their views of the Russia-Ukraine war. We talked to the democratic BRICS, Brazil, India, and South Africa, as well as Mexico and Indonesia. And then we did also have dialogues with Turkey and Israel, both US allies, but neither of whom have actually condemned what Russia is doing in Ukraine, nor have they sanctioned Russia. The previous Israeli government, some members of it did criticize Russia, but in general, Israel was also taking more or less a neutral stance towards this. So what emerged from these conversations was an unwillingness to take sides in what is largely seen as a local European conflict. There is still a great receptiveness to Russian narratives about what caused the war, skepticism about the US version of events, acknowledgement also that Russia has both uses incentives and coercion with most of these countries to make sure that they remain neutral in the conflict. Russian disinformation has been highly effective in persuading publics in many of these countries that the West and not Russia is to blame for this war. And also dependence on Russian hydrocarbons, fertilizer, grain, and weapons has also been a major factor in shaping the views of these countries toward the war. And even as Russia itself is more closely aligning with China, we all see that, the Kremlin has also been quite cleverly using growing concerns about Chinese ambitions in India, in Indonesia, to present itself as a counterweight to Beijing and Beijing's growing presence in the Indo-Pacific area. So Russia has really succeeded in the countries and the people we talk to in delivering its version of what caused the war much more effectively than many in the West, I think, have understood. President Macron has said that he's been shocked by how much credibility we, the West, are losing. The EU Foreign Affairs Chief, Joseph Borrell, has acknowledged, quote, how powerful the Russian narrative is. And through targeted use of disinformation, the Kremlin has convinced much of the world that NATO enlargement was responsible for this war, that NATO enlargement threatened Russia's territorial integrity, and that Russia had no option but to defend itself by launching its special military operation in Ukraine. And Russia is particularly adept at exploiting wariness about the United States in countries like Brazil, India, Indonesia, Mexico, South Africa, to advance its own narratives. It taps into the alienation and the resentment felt in many countries that the war and the West's rivalry with China are distracting attention and shifting resources away from their own very pressing problems and challenges, such as debt, food, energy, climate change, and health issues. But Russia also is able to exploit a deep-seated resentment of the United States. And in that sense, Ukraine really has been a victim of the antipathy of many of countries in the global South, the antipathy they feel toward the US and to a lesser extent toward Europe. Russia's also, and this is another thing that became clear in these dialogues, succeeded in instrumentalizing the Soviet past, blurring the lines between the USSR and contemporary Russia. When we had the dialogue with Mexico, particularly the people, who support the current left-wing government, many of these people, and the same in South Africa, they think of Russia as a socialist country. And so we had to point out to them, no, it's not a socialist country anymore. It has a rather pernicious form of capitalism, but, they're not your comrades in socialism anymore. But memories of the Soviet past, of the Soviet Union's role in supporting national liberation movements, are still very strong. This is particularly true in a country like South Africa, where the ruling African National Congress still has very close ties with Russia. And in fact, when they go to Russia, they meet with the Communist Party of Russia because, again, those are their buddies from the old days. And Russia, of course, presents itself as the anti-imperial, anti-colonial power and reinforces these narratives about the U.S. and the Europeans, of course, being colonial countries. And you saw that last year. President Zelensky had a virtual meeting with heads of states and other officials of the African Union. He wanted to explain Ukraine's side of the story to these African leaders. But only a handful of African leaders actually showed up for what was then a virtual conversation with President Zelensky. But I'm a little bit more encouraged now because if you look at the Jeddah summit a few months ago, where Ukraine's peace plan was discussed, obviously hosted by the Saudis, the democratic BRICS were there and a number of other countries in the global South. So maybe some of this is shifting a little bit. One of the most important reasons, I think, why Russia is still holding its own with these countries and gained ground has less to do with its own efforts. And this is, I think, another phenomenon that's emerged since the war began, and particularly in the last year. And I'm now going to quote Director of the CIA, Bill Burns, what he calls countries that are the hedging middle. Countries, and I'm quoting him again, are intent on diversifying their relationships in order to expand their strategic autonomy and maximize their options, and countries that don't want to take sides. So you've seen a number of countries in the global South see this war as an opportunity for them to increase their own agency and their own regional influence. And they see no benefit really in taking sides in the war. And this war has opened up opportunities for them, which they don't want to give up. So these countries prefer to remain unaligned, and that's why, of course, they haven't condemned the invasion or sanctioned Russia. But a number of things also came out in these dialogues that a number of these experts were concerned about the possible consequences of Russia's strategic weakness, which is playing out on the battlefield and which Nataliya, of course, has told us about. They believe that the war is hastening Russia's long-term decline, and that worries them. Some of the people we talked to expressed concern about what Russia is doing to itself. They don't want a total Russian defeat because they believe that a broken Russia would open a power vacuum wide enough to destabilize countries way beyond Europe. And let me just say a few words now tying this to the situation in the Middle East. So since the outbreak of violence in Israel, the global South has focused on condemning the Israeli bombardment of Gaza, as opposed to focusing on what the Hamas people did, their murder of Israeli citizens. Russia has also somewhat shifted its position on Arab-Israeli relations. Putin has criticized Prime Minister Netanyahu for, of course, the Russians had a delegation from Hamas there in the past few days. So Putin, I think, hoped that the support of Hamas will further boost Russia's clout, again, with the global South, will appeal to the developing world. President Zelensky, as you probably read, offered to go to Israel in the early days to offer support. He was rebuffed by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who apparently didn't want to antagonize Vladimir Putin, a man with whom he did build a solid relationship over the past years. And so we're now in this new situation where those who support Ukraine largely support Israel and its Western partners, and the rest of the world condemns Israel, is at best neutral in the Russia-Ukraine war, or like some countries, I go back to South Africa again, has been engaging with Hamas since the war began. What does this mean practically for Western support for Ukraine? Events in the Middle East, I think, make it less likely that the U.S. and its allies can sway much of the global South away from the views that they hold and towards a greater support for Ukraine. It means that sanctions evasion from countries like Turkey, which has already been very evident, will continue. And I think Russia will continue to try and use this moment when much of the world's attention is diverted away from the Russia-Ukraine war to try and gain a greater legitimacy. So we need to redouble our efforts in the United States to maintain American and transatlantic and trans-Pacific support for Ukraine, funding for Ukraine, which is a huge challenge domestically in the US. And we have to continue to do whatever we can not to go wobbly and make sure that Russia does not prevail in this war.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Maybe just to regain our balance.
Thank you very much. I think it's fascinating, actually, the role of narratives in this, in terms of politics, in terms of power. And obviously, there's a clear intersection between events in the Middle East and Ukraine, and also the message that everyone has had here about not going wobbly. And so I want to thank you very much for sharing your deep knowledge and perspectives on the war in Ukraine. We have, I don't know how many minutes.
Half an hour.
Half an hour. And so, given the enthusiasm of the audience, I am going to just turn the floor over to you. So raise your hands and
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have a quick question on wobbliness. So why? And I think it's a question for Fiona on the US. Germany is one story. Europe promised 1 million shells. It's not going to happen soon enough. Europe doesn't have military capacity. I'm not surprised. I'm disappointed, not surprised. But US has a lot of stuff. Why has US been so slow? And why is not moving fast enough now?
Look, and I think that gets down to our domestic politics as well. Same reasons, to some respects, as Germany and some other countries, but obviously different ones. I mean, I think as I was sitting listening to you, Serhii, talking about spin dictators, we're frankly on the verge of something similar. We're already having, so much spin in our politics that nobody knows what's true and what's not anymore. And we have a faction in our polity that could put all of the other, European populists to shame, and have decided to also use Ukraine and assistance to Ukraine instrumentally. Cloaking it in the guise of the long traditional position of the United States on isolation, no foreign entanglements. If they ever quote anyone, occasionally George Washington and the farewell address, but I mean that sort of disappeared into a whole concoction of other ideological stances there. But I think for the Biden administration, staring 2024 and the November election in the face now, they're trying to basically calibrate, how much that they can do on Ukraine. And that's why I mentioned just in passing that idea of good congressional politics, perhaps bad global, positioning. When Biden decides to put Ukraine and Israel together in an aid package, but also to try to exhort Americans to sort of step up the two countries in a very similar predicament. I mean, as Angela said, that's played actually quite badly for Ukraine, in particular globally. I don't think it really makes much difference for Israel one way or another, but it certainly has actually undercut Ukraine's efforts to get more support with the global south, most definitely. But it was also because Biden recognizes that Ukraine has become, so much of a divisive issue, where Israel, outside obviously of many of the arenas that we're in, but within Congress tends to be more, again, we're talking about Congress here, more of a unifying factor. So it really is tied to how they feel that the elections are going to take shape, and also the fact that Biden also wanted to be the president that took us out of foreign entanglements. Trump, that's his idea as well, not to be a wartime president, and a very easy accusation that Biden is taking us into World War III. So I think that although it's not being stated publicly, there is also that kind of desire to find some kind of an end game that is somehow the result of some de-escalation of the conflict. There's been an obsession about escalation. But as Nataliya has pointed out, the only way really perhaps to change the course of events decisively is for Ukraine to be as militarily strong as possible, even if it doesn't get to retake all of the lost territory, which is going to be a high bar, of course. But to show that Ukraine is really in the game and that militarily can hold its own indefinitely. And of course, as you're pointing out in your slides, the Russia's going to have to spend more and more percentage of GDP on the military to, basically also hold back Ukraine. And then Ukraine needs a very big diplomatic effort on its behalf. And that's, unfortunately, under these current circumstances, not likely to be happening. So the wobbliness is based on everybody's domestic situations. And, you can always regain your balance if you're wobbly. You can do a bit of strengthening up, but it seems unlikely under the current circumstances that we're going to see that.
Serhii Khan, Dartmouth College and affiliated faculty with the center. I want to thank everyone for wonderful, enlightening comments. My question probably is primarily to Nataliya and maybe Serhii, but maybe everyone as well. If the worst case scenario, the financial and military support for Ukraine begins to go down from Germany, maybe in Congress, there's opposition and we see that. And there's talk, we hear it, of Ukraine settling for some kind of compromise, territorial compromise. Could it happen? Is it possible Zelensky would settle for that? And if he does, what would be the reaction of Ukrainian public? Because those of us who have friends in Ukraine, we hear them saying, if he abandons even the Crimea reoccupation, he will be voted out of office, that the Ukrainian public would not tolerate. So my question basically is, and it's something I do not support, is there a chance of some territorial compromise for the sake of peace, quote unquote, or is it totally out of the question that Ukraine is determined to fight even if Western support declines?
I can start. So the question of Ukrainian will to fight, I think should be considered in the context of the question, what is at stake for Ukraine? Yeah. When we look at the invasion of 2014, Russian first invasion of Ukraine, when Ukraine frankly didn't have much military capability at all, where the West was not willing to do what the West did in 2022, even then, there were barely armed Ukrainian volunteers that rushed to the front line. It's actually one of the reasons why the Kremlin, as you recall, 2014, what was Russia's plan, right? Not just to take two little portions of Donetsk and Luhansk, but actually to seize 6 regions. And that plan was thwarted for many reasons, including because Russia actually miscalculated even back then the level of support of local population to Russia, the loyalties of local power brokers, and so on and so forth. But even then, in those circumstances, the will to fight was already there. It's very interesting that plus Ukraine's development of its military capability went somehow unnoticed in the Kremlin, and they've assessed it to be so poor that they thought they could take Ukraine in a matter of days in 2022. But Ukraine would have chosen to fight in beginning of 2022, regardless of whether there was Western support or not. Actually, I remember one of the questions I was asked whether Ukrainians would fight in absence of Zelensky leadership. The answer is yes, too. And as we look now, it's really not necessarily a choice, because there are 2 ways of lives that exist on 2 sides of the front line. On one side, it's the Russian world that becomes as a result of the occupation, and we all know what it looks like, right? It's Bucha or some variation of that. And on the other side, it's unoccupied Ukraine. So it's literally not necessarily a choice. And even therefore, Ukrainians, if you ask them, they would say that they would fight even if the tactical nuclear weapon is used. That would not necessarily mean that Ukrainian will to fight will break, because unfortunately, Putin has shown that there are much worse ways to go than from a blast. So I think the will question, the will remains strong. I think it would be very difficult for Zelensky to walk back after everything of the scale what happened on especially significant territorial compromise.
I certainly agree with what Nataliya just said. Back in 2014, the loss of the territory was a shock, but my understanding is by the year 2022, de facto, Ukraine accepted the loss of territory and learned to live within the new territory. One of the reasons why we still have the latest news, these battles over Avdiivka, this is next to Donetsk, and Russia can't do anything about that in the last more than 1.5 years, is the Ukrainian fortifications, which suggests that Ukraine was actually preparing to defend that territory as opposed to try to attack Donetsk and take over Donbass. But situation changed in 2022. So the latest polling suggests over 80% of the population define victory as return not to the borders of 2022, but as the return to the borders of 91. There is very clear, of course, Ukraine is preparing to take advantage of the new weapons that were long promised, but only now are being delivered or will be delivered, Air Force and attack camps. And certainly I see at least the spring and the summer as continuing warfare. At this point today, it's virtual impossibility for Zelensky actually to accept anything but the land for peace deal is unacceptable to the Ukrainian society. But things change, so a lot will depend on what will happen on the battlefield during the first year of 2024. So we can then maybe return to that question, and there can be new reality on the battlefield, but not today.
Can I just make a quick addendum to this? Because I think what's very clear is there is no appetite for this in Ukraine, and the suggestions are all coming from outside because of others' domestic situations. You're all well aware that, Anja and I are always writing articles together, there's sort of dueling pieces in foreign affairs. This is a kind of an academic debate, and it always overlooks people. And this is again the point. When I was in Germany, I was stunned that they would think that there would be an East, this is not everybody, by the way, but that some people think that there would be an East Germany, West Germany variant, when East Germans remained Germans and had their own passports and, they were in their own country. The people of whatever part of Ukraine is absorbed into Russia would no longer be Ukrainians. And this comes down to a fundamental mistake that all of us made in 1991 in talking about 25 million Russians in the near abroad. And I remember all those debates here. We were studying Pam Jewett at the back there, and I wrote a report with actually quite a few people here involved in it called Back in the USSR, where we were looking at, it's a long time ago, and we were young and thinking of the Beatles, but we were looking at this old debate about who was a Russian, and was it whether language was sufficient. And if you look, all of us are speaking here English. We're not all English, and America basically was a revolutionary power with all of our founding fathers, for the most part, speaking English, and actually many of them being educated in England. And we then, however, start to think that every Russian, be they living in Uzbekistan or Moldova or Ukraine or a Belarusian Russian speaker, was somehow Russian and would identify as such. And I think that was a fundamental error. And of course, as Serhii has said, that was the kind of error that was completely and utterly realized in 2022, because Putin persisted in thinking that anyone who spoke Russian was Russian. And I think a classic example of how identities can change is if you look at Scotland. Where a lot of my family hail from. The head of the Scottish National Party, Hamza Yousaf, is originally from Pakistan. Right. And people expect him to behave like a Pakistani, and he doesn't. He behaves like a Scot, because there's a complete and utter cultural shift in identity and in language. And he speaks Scots English. He doesn't speak Gaelic, but the whole identity is more of a civic place-based identity, and that's obviously what had happened in Ukraine and many other places over the 30-year period. And many Russian speakers, 90% of people in Kazakhstan spoke Russian. But it wasn't 90% of Kazakhstan weren't Russians. And 50% now, speak, but also Kazakh is being pushed up. So we made a mistake in the way that we talked about it back in 1991.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oksana Antonenko from Schumann Center in Florence. Thank you very much. Great to be back and with many colleagues with whom we used to work and debate here in early 1990s. I guess my question is about Putin's strategy and to what extent he's starting to believe his own narrative, something which, Angela, I think, presented very well. The way I see sort of the evolution of the war, indeed, the initial Crimea 2014 was, as Serhii described, I think very well, was about Putin's domestic political drivers, imperatives. February 2022 was an imperial project, exactly as was very well described. But we are now in the third phase, and it is no longer an imperial project in my mind. It is a proxy war with the West. This is what Putin is fighting. He has convinced himself that what he can achieve by outlasting kind of Western unity is to fundamentally reshape the global order. And if you listen to his speeches, the emphasis has changed. He almost never now talks about denazification, although clearly I agree that his aims vis-a-vis Ukraine of subjugating entire Ukraine has not changed. But I think he now has a much broader agenda, strategy, talking about strategy versus tactics. And therefore, this land for peace deal is not going to stop the war, because he is no longer fighting that war. He is now fighting the war to fundamentally outlast and undermine kind of Western-based global order. And I think he feels that he's succeeding in that. And this is the kind of steps he's taking now, for example, withdrawing from from the CTBT, Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, is not to use the tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but perhaps to stage a nuclear test with a view of undermining Western unity. All this, global South agenda, etc. So I think we are in a fundamentally different war, which we need to understand and analyze as such. And I think the only sort of people who do not understand that we're in a completely different war are the Europeans, who still believe somehow. I think Americans have understood it, but the Europeans still believe that we are not in a proxy war with the Russians. That this war is about Donetsk and Luhansk territories and the small territorial, gains. No, it is actually much more fundamental and existential war, which we need to see as such. And therefore, the end of this wars we need to analyze and think about is not about territorial gains or losses in Ukraine. It is whether we can withstand in this new, pretty much existential, geopolitical fight that we are in. And to Serhii, I think very interesting point that you made is whether the Russians now seeing the body bags coming back will perceive Ukrainians differently. I mean, latest Levada poll, really interesting data. Only 21% of Russians believe Ukrainians are the enemy. 21% versus 96 or 7 believing United States is the enemy, Germany is the enemy. So despite of the, body bags coming back, the perception of Ukrainians as being, different is not emerging because of the propaganda. So I guess, my question is to what extent we are equipped to deal with this new war, which is essentially is a proxy war, and acknowledging and what kind of tools we have at our disposal to fight that war and win it.
Mm-hmm. Well said.
Yeah.
Thomas doesn't need an answer. He laid it out. I mean, well summarized.
Yeah. No, I mean, and he really, I mean, you're right that, he still wants to conquer Ukraine, but it's much broader. And he and Putin and Xi Jinping, and then you have to bring the Chinese in, they're both determined to create this new post-West order. I think they have maybe different ideas about what it would be. I think the Chinese would still want some rules. But I think, the people around Putin, they want a kind of a new world order that's a disorder, where the United States doesn't have that kind of role anymore, but where there are necessary, where there are no rules, and where, and where aggression is the order of the day. And I think you're right, because I think much of Europe doesn't understand that it's a proxy war. I'm not sure everyone in the US understands that either.
Maybe I'll jump in.
Yeah.
One way to also understand this war is to look at the narrative that have been developed in Russia in the 1990s in terms of multipolar world. Mm-hmm. And Russia emerging as one of the poles in that world, and by including using the resources of the post-Soviet space. And if that frame really explains, has a good explanatory potential, then this is a global project, and this is certainly a project challenging the West. The way how this war goes so far is, of course, the sort of implosion of Russia in terms of its ability to become really a pole on par with European Union and China. But again, I just want to say that I agree this is a broader global struggle, and that realization of that is something that even in the US is not here fully. If it would be, probably we would have also a little bit different situation in the Congress.
Yeah.
Ipan Zhou, history PhD student, University of Michigan, RICA alum. I have a quick question for Angela. So thank you for a very effective summary of the division between the West and the so-called Global South. And I think in your description, you kind of attributed their not taking a position to their kind of exposure to Russian propaganda and their kind of pragmatic concerns because they receive less attention from the West. But in this reading, because I'm from the Global South, so maybe I listened with bias, I feel it's kind of like the Global South are stupid and selfish, so they suffer from Russian propaganda and they are not satisfied with the West, the West overly attention to Ukraine. So do you see any kind of moral validity of their kind of not taking the position because they are the ones who have been really colonized by Western powers, right? And also in your conclusion, your kind of more practical recommendation is to the US is to increase its support for Ukraine. I totally agree, but in the same time, do you think the West should do something to kind of bridge the gap between the West and the so-called global South?
Well, it certainly should, and I wasn't trying to make any moral inferences there. So if you took that, I didn't. That's not what I meant to say. No, I mean I think the West and the U.S. have not been effective enough in explaining to many of these countries sort of what's involved, and explaining, in fact, even what they're. We haven't really talked about this, but even the Biden administration could do a better job in explaining, what this is really about. I mean, and not talking about democracy versus autocracy, but going back to things like the UN Charter and international law. And I think they still need to do a better one. I mean, what's interesting is for a number of these countries, in fact, their economic relationship, with the U.S. and the West is much more important than the relationship with Russia overall, the economic relationship. I mean, with certain commodities, they are dependent on Russia. And I think but I agree with you that what happened in the past, the historical experience also shapes their views. And I do understand also that this is an opportunity for some of these countries. I mean, remember, this came up certainly in discussions with, for instance, the Brazilians, to assert their own a greater role, and to take this opportunity to get the rest of the world to take their concerns more seriously. So I think. I think all of that is understandable, and I don't think that they'll change their stance. But I think I think the U.S. and its allies need to do a better job also in their interactions with many of these countries.
I'd like to add something to this because, first of all, we shouldn't be talking about global South as if it's one monolith. I mean, we're all, I think, challenged in how we refer to things. We used to call it developing versus, developed countries. We've had all kinds of, different terms here. And there's a very strong differentiation because I've been, part of some of these dialogues that Angela's been leading, depending on where you are. And also kind of views of imperialism and colonization. A lot of countries outside of Europe don't realize that Russia was an empire. Actually, you should, because there's a whole bunch of Chinese territory that Russia, as a European imperial colonial power, took, and would have taken loads of Korea if it could have done as well. The Russo-Japanese War paid to a lot of Russia's expansion. But Russia then went back, after the peace settlement at Portsmouth, Stalin took all that territory back again with southern Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands. So actually, I've been to China and seen the maps that still show that most of the regions east of Lake Baikal are still with the Chinese names, and I know Russians feel uncomfortable about that. It wasn't just the Portuguese and the Brits that were chomping off pieces of China, and China has expanded its own territory contiguously. For a lot of countries outside, there's a kind of a feeling of like the Austro-Hungarian or the Ottoman empires, or China as a kind of an imperial or expanding power, or Russia were not somehow colonial powers because they didn't go overseas. And here in the United States, we forget that we are also an empire, and people see us as such. Hawaiians would say, well, the Brits came and then, the Americans came. We're kind of overseas, right in the middle of the Pacific. We bought Alaska, which is, separated by what used to be British North America, Canada, from the Russians. And this is part of the problem, is I think we haven't fully appreciated how other parts of the world actually see the United States or see Europeans, and the difference in which they interpret empires. Andrew and I were both at a conference where the Ukrainians tried to make common cause on colonialism. It was basically told that Europeans are colonizers. Right. You can't be colonized. And told the Ukrainians just to drop it because they weren't getting any headway. And that's really what Angela was referring to in the kind of propaganda, because Russia is getting away with being the national liberation power, where anybody who looks at Russia would know that was, again, not the case. And there's also an interesting element in Pushkin. And Ukrainians are getting a lot of flack for, basically deposing an African hero. And I hadn't really thought about this until I was talking to many people from Africa and Latin and South America, that when Russia used cultural extension like the Goethe Institutes or Confucius, always through Pushkin houses, and they didn't see Pushkin as white Russian European, they saw him as somebody with an African heritage, were amazed that a European country would have as their national bard an African. And so when Ukraine is hanging the African and pulling him off a pedestal, that's played really badly. And so there's all kinds of ways in which Ukraine has found itself flat-footed because of all of these, different views. And this idea that now Ukraine is a liability to the rest of the world rather than an asset. And the key for this war is to show that Ukraine is an asset and that Ukraine has more common cause with other countries. It's becoming more difficult by the moment.
Hello. Look, Mykhailo, I'm Mykhailo, and I'm with the OECD in Paris, like Serhii. I want to offer two quick questions and one quick remark. I mean, I think just first of all, as has been said, I think the understanding of this war as being a different war is far from a consensus position in the United States, right? And it's also not a consensus position in the European Union, but the European Union is a union of countries and it's a fundamentally different arena for making policy. And I think there has to also be some appreciation of that it's a very difficult process and there's a wide spectrum of views on that. Two questions, a bit more, I guess, action-orientated. I think the first is that should there be a more fundamental wobble from the US administration vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine, how might the course of EU policy change for Ukraine in terms of its support? And should the course of that policy change, how might it change? The second question is, and this is looking forward and perhaps a little bit more optimistic, is that in the first days after the invasion in February 2022, Zelensky signed an agreement with the European Commission to expedite accession to the European Union. Now, it might seem somewhat naive to be talking about this just now, but I'm just particularly interested in Fiona's time that she spent in Germany, what the discussions are around that just now. There was this splurge of diplomatic activity. They also signed an agreement with the OECD. Yeah. I know they're very, very far from being there. I would like to have a sense on what the perception is in some of the European circles that you were talking about that process and whether that is still a viable option. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say something quickly on this because I know that we're kind of out of time. But I think on the EU level, you're absolutely right to say there's a lot of difference of opinion there. And although Germany may have a big influence, also there's difference of opinion in France. You're sitting in there in Paris, the UK, obviously no longer in the EU, but Norway and other countries also trying to figure out how they can, outside of the EU, also have an impact. Some countries are much more supportive than others because it's not having the same effect domestically. I think, a lot of countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and others in Poland, which we also saw prior to the election in a very wobbly position, are worried about becoming net contributors. Because, of course, as you know, probably from hailing from the UK, the net contributor factor of the UK was a major factor in pushing UK away from the EU over time, for worrying about domestic issues and not, and then the kind of the trade-off with having to be a major contributor to the European Union. And I think on that score, I've heard some very interesting discussions about how to bring Ukraine into the European Union that fall short in the short to medium term of what we'd expect of a full-on accession plan in the ways that we've seen it before, but would really kind of start with taking regional bites out of Ukraine. Very hard to obviously do much in the east, but try to figure out how you might start working with some of the regions in the west. And learning quite a lot from Germany's mistakes. We were talking about this last night, about not really, engaging with East Germany in the way that one would have hoped, and taking a much broader regional view and trying to bring different Ukrainian regions and cities in over time. So the EU did a really interesting report at the end of March on all of the ties between EU I say it's interesting. It's kind of also boring, but I mean, I find it interesting. But I wouldn't run off to kind of buy it and absorb it as a great read for the afternoon. But it talks about how Ukraine is paired up with a variety of different European regions and cities, and how they could kind of build on this in the sort of interim to start to pull Ukraine closer in. So there's all kinds of creative thinking going on, and also a lot of public-private sector investment, and people trying to figure out, even before the war has ended, how they could really start to move ahead to give Ukraine a real European perspective without the kind of formulaic approach to a usual plan.
I can jump in. It is extremely important to give Ukraine that perspective and to keep it there, because we are taking almost Ukrainian morale for granted.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it has been there since the start of the war. It continues to be here, but it's also not limitless. And Ukrainians honestly believe that they're fighting not just for themselves.
Yeah.
The war started not in 2022. The war started in 2014 over the issue of Ukraine signing association agreement with EU. So whatever the practicalities and the time frame and line for Ukraine possible entrance, it's extremely important to keep this dialogue going and to be meaningful.
And I think just last week or the week before, some Ukrainian officials met with EU officials, and they're trying to advance now the plan. I don't think we have a timetable, but they're trying to advance it. Yeah.
We will take two very brief additional questions.
Just
one.
Stanislav Stanskih, quick question. There is an ongoing debate whether Russians fleeing political repression and military draft should be granted refuge in the US and in the Western countries, or whether protection should be refused so that these potential refugees go to Russia, back Russia, and rebel against the Kremlin regime. I'm wondering your opinion on that. Thank you.
Do you want to take that?
So should the West provide humanitarian protection for Russians fleeing repression and mobilization campaign?
I don't think it's possible. I don't think it will be happening. As a historian, I can say that we have today probably the largest political immigration from Russia since 1917.
Yeah.
And what was a discussion was here, of course, about the immigration and the future of Russia and what the connection is. And one thing that I can say, and I started this more intellectual history introduction, that whatever ideas have been played out since the times of perestroika and then into the 1990s, they've all developed in one way or another in immigration, because the free discussion, the free debate was impossible in Russia. So whatever the political implication of actions of the Russian immigration today for Russia, the ideas, I think, and the vision for the future will be formed here. So, but that's general comment on the immigration and Russia. But in terms of the policies toward the Russian immigration, Evgenia was saying about that. Okay, the time to decide on that, to adopt policy was back in February and in March. Now we have the reality that we have today.
Hi, I just have a question, kind of follow-up relating to historical borders, maybe for Dr. Plokhy or others. But my curiosity is, you have historical Ukraine before 1918, and then Ukraine post-World War II that was enlarged by Stalin. When Putin speaks, he often argues against Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev, that the Soviet leaders had no right to give parts of Novorossiya and Crimea to Ukraine. sometimes Viktor Orban speaks about Ukraine as the political entity that currently occupies the landmass of Ukraine. I don't know how Slovakia or Poland or Lithuania feel, but I am curious if the future of Ukraine is ever back to independent, smaller, pre-1918 borders, or how long it would be willing to fight for this larger Ukraine created after World War II. No statement there, but I'm just kind of curious how that resolves given the various interests of its neighbors, so to speak.
Thank you. What we have with Ukrainian borders is very much a European or post-Versailles history. So an ethnographic map is taken, and then adjustments are made on the basis of economy and geography. And Crimea eventually ends up in, again, the western parts of Ukraine are mostly on the basis of ethnographic map. But then there are adjustments. Again, Crimea is there because the peninsula depends on the mainland. As simple as that, economically, in terms of administration. So when Khrushchev decides to push through this decision, he's doing a major, he tries to score points in the struggle for power. But he solves a major headache that Russia had at that time, how you rebuild Crimea when geographically and otherwise logistically somewhere else. Looking at the Orban and Hungarians, and the economics a big part of that, and the railroad way it was going. So it's a combination. It's an ethnographic map, but with the additions based on the economic and other reasons. If you look at the ethnographic map of Ukraine and the borders of pre-1918, it would be much larger than today's Ukraine. It would include Kuban. It would include also other parts which are today are the battlefield, but in a different way. Kursk Oblast and Belgorod Oblast as well. So I unfortunately, as a historian, can say that history probably will not help us much in defining what are the legitimate borders. I would stick to the international law, internationally recognized borders as the principle for settling not just Ukrainian war and Ukrainian global crisis, but also just going ahead with this approach to any sort of territorial conflicts or wars in the future. So again, it's not good news for history and historians.
Nataliya. If I just may add, I think there is also an assumption in your question that Putin would be satisfied with taking just those regions. In fact, the only reason that Russia is not occupying Kyiv right now is not because the goal has changed, because they were denied the capability to do so. And I think it's really important to keep in mind as we talk about how the war shapes out. One of the most dangerous scenarios is freezing the front lines in the current configuration, because just think about how much further Russian forces can go if they launch a renewed attack, having had an opportunity to regroup from the current front lines, and how much further they can get. And I think going back to your point, it's not just about Ukraine. Putin still holds the same objectives regarding undermining principles of NATO as well as weakening US. He doesn't have enough bandwidth to focus on that now. But if he keeps territorial gears in Ukraine, he also will be able to go back to that plan and also, frankly, connect the gains with Belarus, which was the plan all along. Its intent slowed, but it's not abandoned. And I think we really should keep that in mind, the kind of military requirement that would impose on Europe and NATO if that actually transpires.
Good point.
Thank you very much, this wonderful panel. I want to say one final thing here that I think this panel demonstrates very clearly is the importance of regional studies. Actually,
Yes.
and centers like the Davis Center. We now have lunch, and I would say that we really continue the conversation over lunch.